You bring up a good point, and you and I talked about debt ceiling negotiations back in January, and you made the point that this is kind of a boring conversation, debt ceiling, but then when it gets to this, the theatrics of it all, that's when people really care because no one wants to default on our debt. When people hear the word recession, they immediately, obviously, that is worst case scenario. So this also comes in the backdrop of a presidential election getting just underway. So politically, right now, who do you see the winners and losers in this fight?
Well, this week, McCarthy is the winner. I think that he proved a lot of naysayers wrong of that, he can navigate the thin margins and kind of the unwieldy nature of some conservatives and put together an increase in the debt ceiling, put together a package and get it passed. But I think the bigger test is to come. And right now, Biden, his goal for running for re-election, he has kind of one saying: don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And what does that mean? It's that people may not love Biden, but they don't hate him. And they're really kind of off-put. A lot of kind of swing voters, a lot of independent voters in suburbs, they're off-put by some perceived extremism on the side of Republicans. Now, whether that's kind of Trumpism, whether that's actions on restricting abortion, all these other things that a majority of Americans take pause in. And so what Biden and Democrats are trying to do is they're trying to tie that kind of perceived extremism with the debt ceiling. They're saying the legislation that Republicans pass will have draconian cuts to things like veterans care, for some support for young families, for healthcare, and for other areas like that. The problem, as we were mentioned, is that a lot of voters just aren't tuning into this stuff besides kind of the diehard partisans. And so I think there's an echo chamber here for Democrats and Republicans on what really matters and versus what really matters to kind of their most diehard supporters. And so I think all eyes are going to be on Democrats. Can Biden and Democrats come up with a reasonable counter proposal that doesn't make them seem like they're the ones that are blocking an increase in the debt ceiling? Because most voters, they have qualms about the debt ceiling. They have qualms about kind of big spending. And what Republicans have put forward is a proposal. But there's going to come a time when the X date nears, where there's more market dislocations besides just in treasury yields and credit default swaps that can really get the attention of your everyday voter who isn't tuning in to kind of the ins and outs of this kind of debt ceiling impasse. And when that comes, who are they going to blame? Some of them will blame Biden, some of them will blame Republicans, but they're going to blame the people in power. And that's a challenge for Biden, who's going to be running against a Republican who, whether that's former President Trump, whether that's Governor Ron DeSantis, whether that's someone else who isn't front and center in these debt ceiling talks and can say, the dysfunction of DC, the dysfunction of things, that needs a new change. And I think then the pressure becomes on Biden to really show that he can actually deliver some sort of negotiation, some sort of deal that leaves him seen like a reasonable alternative than any of kind of the Republicans running for president.
From what you're saying, it sounds like it's Democrats' turn to come to the table. And you mentioned diehard partisans, but I do want to talk about two moderates. One, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and the second is Congressman Josh Gottheimer, who is a Democrat from New Jersey. Both in January were working on a proposal about the debt ceiling. And Brian Fitzpatrick said this week that there needs to be a, quote, two-party solution when it comes to this. What do you think that looks like?
So the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which both Fitzpatrick and Gottheimer co-chair, quietly released a proposal that had the support of a supermajority of their 64 members the same day that McCarthy released the Limit, Save, Grow Act. And what this proposal said was that Congress will suspend the debt ceiling through the end of the year, and it will be suspended again until 2025 if there are certain conditions met. Those conditions include creating a bipartisan fiscal commission to look at spending and ways to reduce the deficit. And it would also try to take some measures on appropriations for fiscal year 2024 and maybe fiscal year 2025. And if those conditions were met, there would be another suspension of the debt ceiling. And what Fitzpatrick was saying, and Fitzpatrick is someone who voted for the Limit, Save, Grow Act, is that In reality, any deal that passes the House, the Republican House, passes the Democratic Senate, and is signed by a Democratic president, needs to be bipartisan. And so we were talking a lot about how Republicans are working amongst themselves and how the hardline House Freedom Caucus has a lot more power. But the real power to create some of these deals is in that small centrist middle that really determines control of the House and the Senate and the White House, for that matter, in each election cycle. And so Fitzpatrick is one of 18 Republicans in the House who reside in districts that were won by Joe Biden in 2020. They have different dynamics and incentives than the Chip Roys or the Matt Gaetzes of the world, or most Republicans who fear most a primary rather than a general election for their political viability. And so what we're seeing with this bipartisan proposal is that when two sides are kind of at an impasse, some third option comes in and they say, look, you may not like this, but the other side doesn't like it as well. And so just come to the table, make some sacrifices, and we can kind of carry the political brunt of this. And we've seen some mileage in the past few years from groups like the Problem Solvers Caucus. There was a COVID aid package in late 2020 that they were able to get through. And then in 2021, it was the infrastructure legislation that they were able to push through when leadership on both sides weren't able to come to a deal. And so this is going to be an important faction to watch moving forward as we try to get into kind of the more negotiation stage of the debt ceiling process and the power that they have in trying to craft a deal and cajoling leadership on both sides to try to find a way out.
As of now, there is no solution. We will definitely keep an eye out on those moderates, but Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said defaulting on our debt would be an economic and financial catastrophe. So first, when is this dreaded X date? When's the drop dead date this needs to be resolved by?
Well, it's something that we can get more clarity on in the days and weeks ahead. There's nothing that kind of gets Congress, Washington D.C. to act like a definitive deadline, and the X date is certainly a definitive deadline. But we were waiting for kind of the tax season in April and seeing what the tax receipts were like and the number of refunds. And at least from some analysts, it's that it was a bit weaker than expected, the number of kind of the tax revenue that we received. And so there were some concerns that this could happen the X date where there's no more money to pay the obligations in early June. But right now, I think the Treasury is going to release something in the next day or so. Some independent analysts, the Congressional Budget Office and the Bipartisan Policy Center have said that they will release their revised estimates in May, in the early May. And so we're going to get a more definitive date here. And right now, the idea and the consequences of default remain largely theoretical. But when you have a specific deadline, a specific date, or at least a more narrow range, it really does create an impetus in Congress to start talking or to start kind of maneuvering beyond kind of the public sniping that's going on right now. Because right now, you do see a lot of market dislocation, that you see kind of 3-year treasuries have a much higher rate, which is kind of an estimate X date of around July, than you see with 1-month treasuries. And you're seeing kind of credit default swap levels, premiums at a very high level. And so you're seeing kind of the initial whispers or warning signs from the market, but that's still not really cajoling Congress. And I think once you get that X date, and once you actually see like public markets becoming more active or more agitated, then I think you start to see a lot more talks going on.